we're going to be talking about the greatest Washington Commanders, whatever you want to call them, football team. Look, they've been had a lot of names. They've had a lot of controversy attached to them, obviously. Um, but this is a video that has a bit of a soft spot with my dad. That was his first ever team that he was his favorite. Obviously, Baltimore didn't have a team at the time when he came to America. The team that won the championship at the time was the Washington Redskins at the time, and then he got attached to that team, and then after Dan Snyder became the owner, then he became eventually a Baltimore Ravens fan. But this one is a very interesting video, nonetheless. Off at number 10, we're going to go with Ken Houston. He was a 12-time Pro Bowler in the history of his career. Both times he ended up being a first-team All-Pro selection. He was only twice in his career. Those were with Washington. Finished his career with over 50 picks, one of the greatest safeties of all time. The reason I don't have him higher than the number 10 is just because half of his career he played with the Houston Oilers. Although his best years came with Washington, he still deserves a spot on this list for the Commanders. At number 9, we're going to go with Joe Theismann. In my opinion, he would have easily been the greatest quarterback in Washington Commanders history due to the success of that mid 1980s, early 1990s Washington Commanders team. Unfortunately, his career got cut short in 1985 due to, of course, the infamous leg snap that could be heard around the world when Lawrence Taylor and Harry Carson both fell on his leg. But Joe Theismann, for a long time, was a rather pedestrian quarterback, relatively speaking. And Joe Gibbs got the most out of him in the early 80s, helped him win MVP in 1983, and he was well on his way to becoming one of the top 5 Washington Commanders of all time. Unfortunately, his career got cut short. Still leads Washington as far as many all-time passing records, and is certainly the greatest quarterback that they've had in the Super Bowl era. At number 8, we're going to go with Russ Grimm. He was the highlight of that 1980s offensive line, more famously known as the Warhogs, just a dominant guard, 3-time first-team All-Pro selection, 4-time All-Pro, 4-time Pro Bowler, a member of the 1980s All-Decade team, and a Hall of Famer. One of the greatest guards as far as being able to pull and get the other way and run block. Just an absolute mauler and just force of destruction in the run game. He was still also very good in the pass protection game as well, and definitely changed the game as far as helping when it comes to offensive line stunt evolution. At number 7, we're going to go with Sonny Jurgensen. Played half his career with the Eagles, played half his career with Washington. In his time with the Commanders, he led the league in passing yards 3 times. Was more safe with the ball and wasn't nearly as aggressive as he was in Philadelphia, but didn't have nearly as many interceptions, wasn't nearly as reckless as he was in Philadelphia with the ball, and helped Washington to have some very successful years in the mid-60s. Sonny Jurgensen is definitely one of the most revolutionary passers of all time prior to the Super Bowl era. And had it not been for him, we wouldn't have some of the best and most efficient deep ball passers that we had over the last 2 decades. At number 6, we're going to go with Charlie Taylor, 8-time Pro Bowler at a time in the 60s where a lot of players were not really going more than 600, 700 yards. He, as well as a few other receivers, were the few that were in the NFL, especially where more teams ran the ball. He was consistently getting 800, 900 receiving yards, always in the mix for Offensive Player of the Year. Charlie Taylor set the standard for what it takes to be a great, all-time great at the receiver position, especially for a Washington Commander. At number 5, we're going to go with Chris Hanburger, the greatest linebacker in the history of the Washington Commanders, at the time obviously known as the Redskins. 9-time Pro Bowler. Several times he finished the season as an MVP candidate or a Defensive Player of the Year finalist. Hanburger was surprisingly very good for an off-the-ball linebacker for getting to the quarterback and getting sacks. He had 45 and a half sacks at the end of his career, which is high up on that list as far as off the ball linebackers when it comes to sacking the quarterback. Hamburger was just dominant and extremely valuable to what was a really, really underrated Washington team in the mid 60s. At number four, we're going to go with a few 80s legends from here. Number four is going to be John Riggins, the hero of the Washington Commanders in their first Super Bowl win in 1983. Of course, having a game winning touchdown early in the fourth quarter of that game. John Riggins finished his career with, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere about 12,000 rushing yards. He was the stable force for that team and the best player even throughout the mid 70s and well deserving of a Hall of Fame title. Um, as far as the depth of the position in the running back, he didn't ever really stand out of the pack. Of course, you had at the time in the 70s, you had players like Franco Harris, Earl Campbell, etc. But for that reason, I don't have John Riggins as high, but he's still, without a doubt, one of the greatest Washington Commanders of all time. At number three, I'm going to go with Art Monk. Finished his career with 12,000 receiving yards. Certainly one of the most underrated receivers of the 1980s and never really got credit as far as accolades go, but was always a Pro Bowler. I think he was, if I'm not mistaken, 9-time Pro Bowler, and always getting 1,200, 1,300 yards a game. Certainly revolutionized the aerial attack, especially for Washington, was key and critical for them winning those three Super Bowls. At number two, we're going to go with one of the godfathers of the modern passing game. That would be none other than Sammy Baugh, otherwise known as Slinging Sammy. Take that nickname as you might. Yes, this is a black and white image because he did play in the 30s, and he's still, to this day, the greatest Washington Commanders quarterback of all time. Will Jaden Daniels surpass him in the short term? There's an argument to be made, but Sammy Baugh has definitely one of the most well-deserving titles, and as far as being on this list, led Washington to several championships in the late 30s and early 1940s. Helped formulate one of the best early quarterback rivalries with Chicago Bears quarterback Sid Luckman. Also one of the godfathers in the deep ball passing game. Extremely aggressive, extremely efficient for his time. And Sammy Baugh definitely deserves to be number two on this list. But at number one, I'm going to go with Darrell Green. Darrell Green is one of the greatest, and I think still one of the most underrated all-time greats at his position ever. Green finished his career with over 50 interceptions, played for 19 seasons. Longevity just doesn't get credit enough for this guy. One of the fastest players in the history of the game. Just incredibly smart and incredibly good at reading the quarterback's eyes. Really great at just running the route for the receiver. Darrell Green, to me, is the greatest Washington Commander of all time.